where do we come from? This is obviously one of the oldest questions that man has been trying to answer. And we can look at it from two perspectives: the modern angle of science and the ancient lens of our past. Combining those two gives us a very interesting view of our future. So today we're going to look at some of the scientific norms for understanding where we come from a very high level, and then curtail that into some of the information about some of the ancient sources of information, specifically looking at one of the biblical tales that comes out of ancient Iraq called the Sumerian cuneiform scripts. Now, there are obviously many different creation tales from the biblical side, whether you look at the Hindu tales, the Mayan tales, today, or even North American tales, but today we're going to be focusing on ancient Iraq's biblical tales. Southern Iraq today has been called the cradle of civilization. It was once called Mesopotamia, Babylon, but originally Sumer in 3800 BC is where modern academics place the shoulders for the rise of civilization. So we'll focus on the creation tales of Sumer, but let's dive into some of the scientific aspects of where do we come from. Okay, so obviously in looking at it from today's lens of the modern science view, we look at it using pretty much terrestrial-based sciences, but also now extrasolar sciences, looking for how life possibly could have evolved whole and complete and arrived here on Earth and then gone through another evolutionary process. It's very hard to explain how life started here on Earth given the 4.7 billion years of evolution that's been happening since the Earth came from a magma state into a hardened crystallized planet. We're talking about 4.7 billion years, and so in that amount of time we still really don't have enough for somehow a lightning bolt to strike some amino acids and magically create a living mechanism that intakes nutrients and expels waste. There are still a lot of questions that need to be raised in order to find the answers. What we can look at too, obviously, is external from our own solar system and external from our own planet, in the idea that we've been able to trace that everything seems to be expanding in our universe from one simple point that they would have called the Big Bang. Now, looking at this epoch of time that has spread out as the universe has continually been expanding from this Big Bang is a very interesting theory, and it looks at how the solar system and planets and various other neighboring solar systems could be affected as they continue to expand out. But when we get into the more specific aspects of, well, how did life evolve here on our planet, this starts to raise a lot more questions around how is it possible that life had the amount of time to evolve in 4.7 billion years. So right now when we look at that track, there's some discrepancies. And so one of the latest scientific ideas is called panspermia, in that to have created some type of life in an already minimal state functioning, that could have arrived on Earth in a prekaryote, or we have various names for life forms at a simplistic form that possibly could have been brought here on a comet, and then once placed into the oceans of Earth or on the landmass over millions, possibly billions of years, we then have an extended evolution. Now, there are still gaps in that, obviously, too, as we approach human evolution, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But obviously, looking at some of these esoteric topics, it's very interesting to note that the scientific community has been revising its understanding of the creation tales of life from a scientific viewpoint, because there really isn't any way to explain life kind of evolving here naturally on Earth. The understanding today is an analogy that if a lightning bolt struck a pool of amino acids and somehow whimsically made that into a life form, the chances of that happening are like a tornado going through a junkyard and correctly assembling a 747. Not going to happen. Could happen, but just not going to happen on the logical side of variables. So a lot of these new theories about panspermia, life arrives whole and complete, a lot of the things that they see out there in space when they sample comets and various debris, is that there are a lot of mechanisms already in place for life to evolve in space under freezing temperatures. Buckyballs and various complex carbohydrates and amino acids that are needed to form life, we find freely floating around in space. So it's very possible that through natural evolution, life actually arrives whole and complete here on Earth and then starts an evolutionary process. And even recently, there's been a twist on the panspermia idea, is directed panspermia. So that's some type of life form, right? Some type of literal intelligence directs life to this planet. So very interesting that they've had so many questions raised that they're now starting to even put the idea out there from a scientific level to say it can't be by chance that life has been evolving on this specific planet. And it's probably not. I think as we expand our sciences to other planets, we're going to quickly see within the next 10 to 20 years that life is being harbored on all of the planets within our solar system. That's my personal opinion. But that's based on the evidence that I've been looking at from all the conglomerate space agencies deploying packages across the solar system. Okay, so some of those packages that we can look at as an example would be Europa. Now, Jupiter's moons have all types of different geological surfaces. We see some of the moons have volcanic activity. Some of the moons have deep oceans, like Europa, possibly a 40-mile deep ocean. But it's covered by this sluggish ice layer that's kind of always shifting around. So they theorize, just like on Earth, if we go down to the deep parts of the ocean on Earth, we find these thermal vents where there's no sunlight, just heat and minerals emitting out of a vent. And there's life all around the vent, shrimp, crabs, all kinds of just insects and things that are living off this, well, I shouldn't say insects, I guess, more or less just, plant life and plankton and such, microscopic animals that are all living off of this hot vent. So the same idea applies that if we were to go to Europa and pierce through this ice layer, we might be able to find also thermal vents on Europa and life thriving at these locations. So there's really going to be a lot of opportunities for us to look at planetoids, comets, asteroids, various things that are in abundance in our solar system. And as we deploy more space packages, drones, and craft actually piloted by people, we're going to study more of these debris and comets, start to mine asteroids. And not only are we going to find exotic elements, but more than likely we're going to change our understandings of what it means to find the signs of life. Now, obviously, we get to a more interesting topic, which is human evolution, bypassing a large scope of data and looking at evolution in general. There are so many questions that still need to be raised about just how did we get here? And really, that's the more important question. So really, that boils down to the idea of a missing link. And I obviously would take my hat off to gentleman Lloyd Pye that you see here, who wrote a book called Everything You Know Is Wrong. Now, Lloyd did a very esoteric level of research that looked at all the various Australopithecine and Neanderthal and various bone structures that we have that look at this Darwinian evolution process to say that something ever so simplistic will become ever more complex. Well, that might not always be the case. There's definitely what we've called a missing link in the human evolution scope. Because if we look at the Neanderthal man, to us, all of those bones and types of beings that have existed, there's definitely nothing that connects us to any of them. There's a huge gap from Neanderthal or Australopithecine, any of these pre-hominid man, to what we have today. As far as looking at our DNA, our double helix DNA, there's a lot of differences. Now, obviously, in comparison, we're very close to the chimpanzee, and that would raise a lot of questions as to why there's literally only a 1% difference in DNA from a chimpanzee, yet somehow we're completely evolved into a different path outside of any other animal on the planet. That's another question that we'll have to come back to. But there's definitely a missing link. Everyone acknowledges that the Darwinian evolution, that view, can't explain the gaps of why these large ape-like beings covered in hair, perfectly adapted to the jungle, and then all of a sudden us. If you stripped us naked and threw us in the jungle, we'd get scraped up by branches, get sunburned. We're not adapted to being in the jungle or even being, freely in nature. So it is very interesting to look at the human process, that somehow there is this missing link, and it is acknowledged by the scientific community. Now, when we start to go down this path and realize, well, all right, where is the oldest civilization that we have? Where does the first signs of high civilization and culture show up? Right now, folks, we put that at 3800 BC on the shoulders of the Sumerian culture. Now, the books are definitely changing as I record this video, because we are finding sites all around the world that are pushing back the needle of time, probably well beyond 50,000 BC, let alone 3800 BC. So we have a lot of catching up to do, folks, but let's starting off from the academic viewpoint, the Sumerian culture, that rests on their shoulders for the first high civilization, a complete civilization to show up, 3800 BC. And really the Sumerian culture is fascinating from two perspectives. One, they have a wealth of information. They literally created over 100 of the firsts needed for a high civilization that we still use today. But two, they have all of the modern biblical tales of Noah, the Great Flood, Adam and Eve, all of the great tales that we have in the King James English version of the Bible can be traced back through the Hebrew versions, through the Akkadian versions, to what you're going to see today in the Sumerian cuneiform scripts, the biblical tales for the origins of our modern day King James version of the Bible. So pretty interesting information, because these artifacts still exist and are a much more condensed story rather than the consolidated stories we have today. Okay, so what we're talking about is this fertile strip of land here, which was once called Sumer, right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers here, this fertile strip of land. And what we found in this area are thousands of tablets and cylinder seals, which you see here, and many types of artifacts, from figurines and jewelry to actual physical locations like the city of Ur, which we thought was a mythical place, but no, it's real. So the Sumerians had a very ingenious way of having this system of writing. And we think we're complicated with our 26-letter alphabet. The Sumerian cuneiform script consisted of over 400 characters. So they had this system of writing where they would use an oversized screwdriver and turn it and twist it in the wet clay to make the symbols that you see here. But they also had cylinder seals, where they would reverse carve images, scenes, onto a curved surface. Scholars today still don't know how they did this. They would reverse carve an imprint so that when you would roll it over wet clay, it would leave the positive imprint. So they were able to disseminate pictograms with actual texts, kind of like an ancient newspaper, if you will, quickly throughout the town. And they had an unbelievably complex math system. They used two numbers, 6 and 10, to form a sexagesimal system. And they could essentially divide into very small sizes, very large sizes, very interesting geometric shapes. This comes out of a book by a scholar named Zachariah Sitchin, who, in uncovering some of the Sumerian tablets about math, talked about when they would have someone that was married and would get a divorce, or someone would die and they would need to split up the property of the family, it would say, well, since you're a brother, you get here, or if, since you're an aunt, you get this slice. If you're a niece or an uncle. So they divided it up based on the weight of your family presence and used math to calculate the plot of the land. But really, what's really interesting here about the Sumerians is the fact that their number system and calendar is what we still use today. 12 months in a year, 12 in a dozen, 12 inches in a foot. All of this information are derivatives of their base math of 60. They were the first ones to even give 360 degrees to a circle. So it's a very interesting math system where literally sprung up right out of the Stone Age at 3800 BC. Just there is no preceding culture from the Sumerians that we know of yet. Okay, so really, again, one of these scholars that I highly recommend to dive into our origins is Zecharia Sitchin. Now, Zecharia Sitchin has been publicly chastised for his research, and he passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago at the age of 93. But Zecharia Sitchin did 50 years of research. That's 50. And there's really no one today that has done that level of research for that long. And unfortunately, people who attack Sitchin really do not have any challenging basis in their linguistic skills. There's really two forms of information when we look at our ancient past. There are the written texts, and then there are the artifacts. So Sitchin was definitely an expert in the written word. And anyone who challenges Sitchin on the written word should really have a basis to challenge him in. And there's a lot of scholars out there today writing books or throwing up websites trying to challenge Sitchin, and they really have no basis in their education because they're challenging Sitchin from the wrong viewpoint. He is a linguistic master, and you would need to have the right credentials and background and that time in the field to get anywhere near the type of research he's presented. So Zecharia Sitchin wrote a book called The 12th Planet, and then spawned out over, I believe it's 10 or 11 books in something called the Earth Chronicles series, where you can really see how all of this information from these ancient times, when it appears man was interacting with living gods and living more peacefully with the earth, all of this information was recorded from cultures around the world and seemed to be sharing in a global epoch of a much more interesting time than what we have today, being disconnected from our spirituality or from these ancient gods that all the cultures seem to speak of. But again, focusing on the Sumerian culture, Zecharia Sitchin was one of the first to bring out some of these creation tales that are written in this ancient Sumerian text called cuneiform script and show the parallels of this information to our modern day Bible as possibly the original stone tablets telling this story. Pretty heavy. Now, what we have in the form of these tablets are usually on semi-precious stones, but as I mentioned, they would also turn it and twist it on wet clay and then put that clay tablet into a stove, literally keying that phrase, writing in stone. So they had several artifacts that would display sometimes pictographic information, but also sacred information. And there were astronomer priests that would only hand down this information to other priests as sacred information. These, as stone tablets, for instance, talk about the zodiacal breakdown of our heavens, the 12 symbols that make up a celestial clock of time. We call it the 12 houses of the zodiac. The Sumerian culture was one of the first cultures that actually utilized this astronomy-based calendar system, just like we now know many cultures, over 30 in fact, used a very accurate astronomy-based calendar system of time. Mayans, Hindu, ancient Egypt, Sumer, all around the world utilized this ancient time by watching the movements of the heavens and using the 12 constellations of the zodiac as a grand celestial clock. Obviously, we'll come back to this topic. Now, several of the tablets seem to describe and give the same references to where these beings came from that were interacting with the Sumerians. The Sumerians gave a word for these beings that was Anunnaki, and the term Anunnaki simply meant those who from heaven come to earth. They were always symbolized with a winged disc, or symbolized with having wings. And this predates Christianity by at least 4,000 years. Hebrew versions of angels and the Watchers and the Fallen Ones and the Nephilim, again, thousands of years even before these stories. So we'll circle back to the topic of the Anunnaki, but what's obviously key to the Sumerian information is that they recorded the movements of the heavens, sometimes over hundreds of years in certain scales. And this was all sacred information. They could literally tell you 50 years in advance on one specific day when there would be a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse. So they monitored the movements of the heavens in a very religious way and recorded this information as sacred data. We have several tablets that come out of the Sumerian culture that speak of our outer planets in our solar system, the distance between our outer planets, what the outer planets even look like in space, calling Uranus and Pluto Mosh Sig, bluish green. Now, we weren't able to confirm any of this information until the late 70s and 80s, when we sent Galileo and Voyager, our space probes, to the outer planets and finally took color pictures. And wouldn't you know it, it confirms the Sumerian descriptions from thousands of years ago. So obviously they had very accurate astronomical data. How? Now, again, this was sacred information. So a lot of this information was recorded from an actual priest sitting in front of an Anunnaki. There would be a scribe, someone who could read and write cuneiform script, that would sit there with the priest and would record all of this information in front of one of these gods, one of these Anunnaki. And we literally have thousands of these tablets still in their original form today in museums around the world. Now, some of these tablets get into some very interesting topics. This one, for instance, even though it was badly damaged, we're going to focus on just this section here. What this section talks about really should raise a lot of questions. It talks about the path that these Anunnaki took from their mountainous planet to get to Earth. And they literally talk about they had to pass by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 planets before they arrived at Earth. And you can see words on the side here. High, 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 vapor, clouds, rocket, rocket, pile up, mountain, mountain. How is this information on a stone tablet that's at least 3,000 years old? So this really raises a lot of questions. And if you think of the idea that they said they had to pass by 7 planets before they got here, again, we can start to look at some of this as astronomical data, and we'll circle back to that. It's a funny concept to think about that we're actually on the 7th planet, that sacred number 7. If you're coming from outside our solar system in, Earth is the 7th planet, not the 3rd rock from the sun, counting the other way. Okay, so really what I want to focus on here is this next part, which is the Anunnaki. And we understand that there are many cultures around the world, not just the Sumerians and their understandings of these Anunnaki. Even the Hindus talk about Krishna and various other gods that were a part of everyday lives of people living in our past. Let's call it the 3000 BC era. So what we have are, in more modern times, translated, consolidated versions of these stories where we have beings that are angelic with wings and have a glow. Well, where does this information really come from? And where exactly is heaven? All cultures just say that they came from the skies. Well, let's get more specific. The Sumerians were very specific in saying that these beings, the Anunnaki, literally had the power of flight. And they depicted them always in this type of a winged craft. Now, there were no hot air balloons. There were no glider planes. The only thing flying at the time in 3000 BC were birds. So the only way they could convey flight was to use a natural, no technological reference, a natural reference. They would give it wings. But you can see here, even the wings don't quite look like wings. They're more a symbolic reference. Now, we can see that this Anunnaki is coming down to meet a Sumerian king. And always we see this over and over, that this platform is being held up by the civilians so that this interaction can take place. I jokingly like to call these the taxpayers. But over and over we do see this scene throughout Iraq, throughout Iran, where the Anunnaki are depicted coming down from a winged disc, usually in some type of conveyance of flight that shows them with wings, coming down to meet a Sumerian king. Over and over we see this depiction as a religious stela. They didn't carve these intricate things as just mythology. This is sacred information that they're trying to bequeath to us, where a picture is 1,000 words. We just need to understand the dialect. So It's a very interesting tale that to realize over and over they talk about these interactions with these beings that came down from the heavens. This couldn't have been just mythology. What's really interesting too is the detail in which they went to describe these beings. This is a statue after one of the Anunnaki, a female Anunnaki called Ishtar or Inanna. And what's really interesting is not only look at the level of detail, literally screws in the hand, it's an amazing artifact. But there's a text that came along with Ishtar, which is very interesting. She liked to roam the skies of Earth and look for male cohorts to take up into her sky abode. Unfortunately, when she would do this, the males would usually not return. So one time she propositioned a Sumerian king named Gilgamesh, a very famous figure in our history. And since Gilgamesh knew of her not returning the males, he said, no thank you. Even though you're extremely beautiful, I'll pass. So very interesting, some of the tales that we come out of our history. Now, a lot of the symbology, again, is depicting information about these beings that I think is very interesting. We can see symbolic references here of holding a pine cone. It's basically, again, representation of the fruit of life, knowledge, the pineal gland. We see here a basket of water, the water of life. All of this, again, is symbolic references. But then, interestingly enough, here we see something that could be a wristwatch. That, again, should raise some questions. Now, you think this is just an analogy that they're trying to show us, but pay close attention. What happened when we land the first man on the moon?
Big shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right low. 30 seconds forward, drift. We copy you down, Eagle. The Eagle has landed.
The Eagle has landed. Now, what an appropriate choice of words. If we were to look at this symbol 6,000 years from now, do you think that they're going to say that we were landing birds on the moon? No. More than likely, they're going to understand that we're saying we had the power of flight. And that's exactly what we see when we look at these Sumerian descriptions of the Anunnaki and realize that what they're showing us is a being that literally had the power of flight. And over we see these references coming out of ancient cultures. Okay, so kind of moving on here, some of the references also show a very interesting similarity to our DNA strand. This tree of life is something that over and over we've seen in modern references towards our double helix. Now, you can go to any doctor's office and see this 2 entwined serpents. That, again, is a symbolic references for modifications to our DNA or understandings that we are a double helix DNA. And this goes back even to our most ancient of times, that somehow they depicted this information. And always depicting above it or involved are these beings that had the power of flight, the Anunnaki. So it's a very interesting tale that, around the world we have these various depictions of what appear to be scenes over and over of man interacting with these beings, the Anunnaki. And these are tablets that are found in the British Museum, in the Louvre, in Turkey, around the world. There are cylinder seals where mainstream science has these on display and is translating what we see here from a very basic and high level. But modern academics is not willing to, they pretty much have drawn a line in the dirt. And anything that talks about these beings, the Anunnaki, coming down and having interactions with man, this is all mythology. It's made up, is what they say. I don't think so, folks. I think what we're looking at here is a very deep level of very high esoteric sacred information that we need to decode. Now, we don't look at the ancient languages and pictograms the same way that we do today. Think of a lot of these symbols as acronyms, like FYI means for your information, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. But when you see CIA, you instantly know it's an acronym. And that's exactly how these ancient cultures used symbolic references. Sumer, Egypt, Mayan, they all used these symbolic acronyms. A picture is 1,000 words. So keep that in mind when you see these ancient scripts Sometimes this scene is actually meant to display a much more intricate wealth of information than just one simple meaning. Now, again, look at the detail and intricacy and design that they went into these artifacts, the colors and things, and always this prominent winged disc. This really does raise a lot of questions. We have to wonder if why around the world at the 3000 BC era, whether it's the Hindu god Krishna living at the city of Dwarka, as we've talked about, or the Sumerians interacting with their living gods, the Anunnaki, something took place well in our past that we are now disconnected from, and we must find out why. Now, again, some of these tales that we have in the English version of the Bible talk about, for instance, the 7 days of creation. Well, in Sumerian, there are actual 7 physical tablets of creation that give you a much more elongated tale of about how we come into existence. And this is really crucial information, folks, because just like the Bible says today, there were once giants upon the earth, we as ancient explorers need to look into our past at many of the ancient cultures, many of the ancient sites, and truly discover where we really do come from. Thank you so much, and stay tuned.